This is just something I worked up. I'll do it for you. Maybe like it, maybe you don't.
Hello, I'm Jake, and this is the Maybe You Like It podcast, the podcast where we take a play or film that has either never been staged before or is never likely to be staged again, and we talk about how we stage it. As always, I'm joined by Caleb.
Hello.
And this week we're joined by lighting designer and friend of the pod, Will Hayman.
Hi guys, thanks for having me.
No worries. So this week we are talking about Attack the Block. Will, would you like to give us a little rundown of what Attack the Block is all about?
Yeah, of course. So the loose premise of Attack the Block is hoodlums are in the street, and when they come across this nurse walking home and decide to mug her. But all goes wrong when they find out that a massive meteor crashes into a car on the street, and then all hell breaks loose for them. It turns out this meteor is an alien who's crashed. So the gang go to try and raid the car for any valuables that might be inside it, and decide it would be a fun idea to chase this alien down. The leader of the gang, Moses, ends up killing this alien, and then unfortunately for him, a load more violent, scarier aliens come in and attack, and then chase down Moses, and then the film continues with their battle against these aliens, essentially.
Yeah, so it's made in 2011. It's kind of all about that era of living in a council estate or a council block in South London, but it's told through the sort of frame of having these aliens attacking the block and the kind of how that affects that kind of community.
And we see the dynamics between them.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we're going to put this in a theatre. What kind of theatre do we want to put it in? I mean, I watched this film and I was concerned because there's just so many settings.
Yeah.
So how do we want to find a way to simplify that? Has anyone got any ideas?
I think, first of all, there's a way of trimming some of the settings so that they're either not there or they're off-stage action that is kind of explained later on stage. I also think with a simple set, you could make it quite sort of malleable to the different settings. So, I mean, I think you could even attempt to do it in a small black box studio theatre, sort of, 50 to 100 seater, and there's probably enough that you could do with lighting and sound to create those settings that you could potentially even do it, sort of quite small budget in that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I agree, because if we're trying to do it in a large scale theatre, then we've got to think of ways to realistically create all of these. I mean, I'm just looking on that page here, I've got about 15 different settings here, and I think that would be pretty much near impossible. So I think trying to work in a minimalist setting would probably be best, so I'm up for that.
Yeah, I mean, so I was thinking along the same kind of lines about the minimalist setting, but to be honest, I very much saw it in a bigger kind of venue, so like a kind of playhouse scale stage, that kind of thing, the kind of 650 sort of seater, Pross Arch, Fly Tower kind of space, simply because the things that it would allow you to do, all the fireworks going off all the time, shout to me pyro is the best way you can do it. And you can't do that effectively in a black box studio. But I think the minimalist set thing is perfect, because you're right, you can't constantly have, say, 15 different settings. So in my mind, you're focusing on the main one, which Caleb touched on in his introduction, that it's all about this kind of council block life, this council living in a council estate lifestyle. It's in the title, it's Attack the Block, right? So in my head, you have this big concrete-like structure at the back of the stage, and by its very nature, is very flat, very monotone, and it gives you space to then kind of build on top of it, whether that's projection or whether that's bringing stuff in front of that, flats flown in maybe, to give kind of the sense of things coming from the sky, it ties it all in. I'm thinking in my head of a recent production of Mallory Towers that's currently touring the UK. That itself has a lot of different settings in it, but their set is just one big, it's essentially like a castle on stage that is just plain white, and they create all of their settings through projection, whether that's projecting a kind of riverscape onto the back, or a skyline, or a chalkboard for the classroom. That's how they do that. And I think that kind of imposing, grey, monotone council block structure would really get across the sense of the play, but also give you space to build on top of it if you want to create these other settings.
Well, and you were saying about the film off air, Jake, that whole setting of the block is like used as an establishing shot throughout the film, as like, there's this sense that it's almost kind of ethereal and like spaceship-like, but it's also like setting it as this is one place with lots of people living it, and it creates one community. So I think actually if we're going down the route of a bigger theatre, having that big setting at the back of a block, and then projecting, not necessarily with projection, but as in projecting onto that new settings through lighting, bits of set, and even then you can still use minimalist set. I'm thinking like, you know, your standard like black blocks and things like that kind of build into different bits of set, and it would be more about the way that the actors use those bits of set rather than what they actually look like. And I think audiences these days are pretty susceptible to just being taken along with, if someone's lying on this, it's a bed, if someone's, you know, three people are sat along it, it's a sofa kind of thing.
It's all about suspending disbelief, right? That phrase gets thrown about all the time. If the characters are there talking on stage about this is an underground car park, then all you need is a bit of low lighting to kind of deal with that, and then the grayscale background of the stage will work fine, and the audience will get the location from the context itself.
Absolutely, and as you say, that gives us opportunity for pyrotechnics, which there are a couple moments in the show that would require that, but it also gives an opportunity to project onto the back, and there's a couple moments that I think that you could effectively use projection. To sort of tell parts of the story.
Okay, so let's say then we've decided that we're going with a kind of small but technically capable space, so an intimate but technically, but something like the Almeida or the Young Vic or something along those lines.
I think, to be honest, one thing that's in my head is as soon as you try and go much bigger than that, so you think about kind of your ATG theatres, big touring spaces, then the kind of audience that's going there is going to be expecting the very kind of realist bells and whistles entertainment theatre. So if you're putting Attack the Block on something about fireworks, crashes, road chasers, things falling out of the sky, and you go in and present this kind of minimalist thing where in theatre you can't achieve those to the very realist degree, then I think ultimately audiences are going to be expecting a physical flaming ball somehow coming through the sky. Whereas putting it in that slightly smaller but still capable space allows you to get away with that more kind of
absolutely.
Representative staging as opposed to anything else.
Yeah, I think that definitely works. Yeah. Well, we talked a bit about set. I suppose we could talk through the settings quickly and talk about how we might present those on stage, and that way we can talk about the set, but also the lighting and sound and stuff as well. Do you want to go through those?
Yeah, for sure. So we start off. I guess we start at the beginning. We start off outside. We start off in the mugging scene is the kind of important section, which immediately leads into them finding this smaller alien that kickstarts the plot. So they're on a road with cars on either side. I think this one in the minimalist space is pretty easy. I think we just have nothing on stage really, and I think it's quite easy to believe that is a road.
And I mean, a lot of the time when I'm doing lighting design, one of the main things in my head is I'm thinking about where is the light coming from in this situation. And nighttime's always a hard one because, well, there is no light really other than reflection. But then by putting a kind of blue backwash on stage, it tricks your eye into thinking that that's just dim blackness.
And you have streetlights as well.
But that's and that's what I'm saying. So you're saying nothing on stage, but you've got light coming from streetlights. You put one or two practical streetlights on the stage, then immediately the audience is like, right, we're outside, we're at night time, the streetlights are on, we know exactly where we are, and that's one really cheap thing that you can just put on to immediately create the setting.
Yeah, I think those first few scenes take place outside, and I think that there's a way of doing that with, as you say, pretty much nothing on stage, maybe a couple of streetlights, and then from there you go into the underground car park, if I'm not mistaken.
There's a little bit first where they all decide to kind of kit themselves up, and this is when we see there's an old lady that takes in Sam, who gets robbed, into her apartment, and then we see all of the boys go into their own apartments, and we see how they interact with their own family. One of them lives with their grandma, and there's a single dad, single mum kind of thing, showing. I think the point is to show the varied but similar in some ways socioeconomic backgrounds that they have.
So this is a moment that I feel we could do with cutting on stage, because it's a moment that really works for the medium of film, but for stage wouldn't work. I think instead you could have the moment where they're all deciding to suit up, and then they come back on stage ready and suited up, and whether you have that in some kind of sort of choreographed moment where they're suiting up, they're all in separate spotlights across the stage and they're all suiting up but just on stage, I think maybe that would work. But I think, you know, you've got to think not only about like that's showing several settings at once, but also it's increasing the cast size by an incredible number for very small cameo roles. So it'd be a moment that I would cut down and try and present in these like sort of separate spotlights across the stage. Perhaps.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Yeah, I get you cutting down that, definitely, and I think the point about cast size is a really big one. But I think like by cutting out that scene, you're losing not the kind of suiting up element, because I don't think that's the focus. You're losing how these boys are interacting with their families, because Samantha is constantly asking Moses, who do you live with? When they go into his apartment at the end to turn on the gas and sort that out, he tells us that he's living with his uncle, but his uncle's away all the time. And it's all about that kind of council estate life. So in my head, if we're going with the council estate style housing at the back of the stage, in my head, it's the kind of terraced block, 3 sort of balconies high of a row of flats. So all you'd have to do is kind of cross-light each one individually, and you wouldn't have to have a different location because each scene takes place on the balcony of their house as each individual character is running into the door and then running out again. But there's still room for the dialogue there. And even if the dialogue came from off stage, you could have the windows in the house lit up from behind to give the impression of someone inside, or even a silhouette, which only one actor does. But it's, again, you have to think about what's the bits that are important to cut, whether it's essential to the plot. I don't think it's impossible to do, but
I think in some ways that could be a solution. In some ways that moment of Moses at the end could be left as a reveal anyway, if we haven't had those early moments. But I take your point, and I think if there's a way of making it work without having to increase the cast size hugely, then that works as well, and we can kind of either of those solutions probably works for that moment.
Yeah, because we want to be careful with if we're thinking so much about getting the major plot points across, what we'll lose is that those plot points are actually there as devices to tell us about something about the way people live in this area, or area is probably the wrong word, in this state. I don't know what the word is. So yeah, I think it'd be really good to try and get those things in. I think having a 2-tiered stage would get us there really nicely. I like that. And then still before the underground car park, we see the weed room, which I think we should talk about, which is really cool.
I think that you can do with, you could fly in some sort of like halogen lights, right? And then you can project onto the back. If we're using the sort of grey sort of background, you can project onto the back a sort of, in the film, it's rows of weed plants, and you could just project that behind the characters, and you can see the rows of weed plants behind them in some ways. And then you have the halogen light bulbs to give that light on stage. And I think that would kind of give us that setting without having to bring loads of stuff on stage and take it all off again, and keep the stage pretty free for the actors to do whatever they want with.
I completely agree with that. I'd add one thing, though, in my head, because when I first watched that scene, the impression it gave me was a kind of Breaking Bad style aesthetic in the final series of Breaking Bad, when they start cooking their meth inside these tents, inside houses, because you've got all this tarpaulin hung up. So I'd do the exact same thing, but I'd fly in a massive sheet of tarpaulin right in the front of the stage, and I'd probably back project onto it. So giving the impression of all the weed behind this sheet, but then you still have this kind of division and acting space in front. I love the idea of flying in fluorescent lights, so I think that works really well.
I like that.
Works really, really well.
Got a lot of flybars going.
Again, but that's in backing as well, why we should use a kind of bigger theatre space. It needs to be technically capable.
Yeah. So then we have, still, before the underground car park, we have the police car moment where the boys are arrested and then these aliens come and kill the police officers. And so we've somehow got to work that out.
So my suggestion for this would be, I've seen a couple of productions at Chichester Festival Theatre that use this technique for cars, where they just have a bar with 2 headlights on, and then they just have 2 actors or 1 actor holding that bar, and the stage is in pitch black. You could do that with a police car. You have a bar with the headlights, and then someone else holding the lights, the blue and red lights above. Bring that onto stage, and then you've told the audience there's a police car there now, and then the action that takes place outside the police car can be lit in front of that, and then the action that takes place inside can be lit in that area. And it kind of means that the actors themselves create those spaces that are smaller than the kind of grand space of the stage that we're trying to use.
Yeah, I completely get that idea, but for me, watching the film, this was one of the big sticking points for me, and it wasn't necessarily presenting the cars or presenting kind of the crash or the aftermath of that. It's how do you get the motion, because so much of this film is about fast-paced motion, whether it's on bicycles, whether it's the big car chase scene, whether it's the head-on collision between hi-hats and the police car. And I haven't found an answer. I don't know how you present the fast car chase motion that you see so often in films, in James Bond films, that works so well. On stage, I don't get how
I think the combination of that technique with the bars with lights on, with sound, can create that atmosphere. I've seen it used in a production I was actually in, where the lights are being taken round the stage with this sound of the car going, and the way that they sort of combine, it gives that sense of motion, especially if the stage is in complete blackness. As the lights go across, it looks as though they're going faster than they're actually going.
Yeah, and I think if you're using haze at this point as well, then you get the
this
beam
should
of
be
the
hazy
head.
light.
I imagine using haze throughout.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure we'll get to it later, but there are so many scenes in the film when the block is well and truly being attacked that the whole corridor's filled with smoke. And that's one thing you definitely can effectively portray on stage using a smoke machine, and that give that kind of what can you see, what can't you see, by piercing light through it to reveal characters, to disappear characters. That would work really nicely.
Yeah, I also think with maybe not the car scenes, but with some of the chases that involve running after aliens, you've got the opportunity for using the space in which the audience is in as well, and coming off the stage.
Yeah, I think that could definitely work. I mean, so just to speak about the aliens quickly, we were talking about before using sort of warhorse style costume puppets sort of merged with these sort of costumes that include the whole actor. So the great thing about the design of these characters is they're these big furry black aliens, but then their mouths are sort of luminous blue. So that gives the perfect opportunity for a puppeteer to be covered with the black cloak so you can't see them, but to have that control over the mouth to breathe life into these sort of alien creatures on stage. And to have that chasing around the audience would look amazing if you have these sort of LED like blue mouths and then the black sort of fur cloaks over the actors who are playing them.
Yeah, so I immediately got quite excited when I saw these aliens, and there was one line in the film which particularly caught my mind, because as a lighting designer I'm constantly thinking about colour and colour theory, and there's a point where I think it's Moses looks at this alien and says, wow, that is black, that is blacker than black. And the point is that there was a scientific material discovered recently that scientists have claimed to be the darkest black that absorbs all light, and it seems like that's the material that they're presenting this as. So to somehow create that on stage, I don't think it's impossible, because it comes through the costume, but to create that real sense of darkness, it's almost the opposite of what I do as a lighting designer. I'm always thinking about where to put light, and trying to get these aliens represented on stage, we've got to suck the light away, and that'd be something really interesting to work with costume in. But then having these LED teeth, it's almost the same as you would with fibre optics, where if we get a kind of moulded frosty plastic for the teeth, you run a fibre optic cable down somewhere in the costume with a bit more room, stick a light source in, and then you've got these teeth can really glow up nice and brightly.
Yeah, and I think as you're saying that there's real opportunity for either puppetry in that way, or for there literally just to be a person in a big black costume, because the aliens are so, like, they're just simple quadrupeds. They're very simple things that actually would be really, really interesting opportunity, I think, for actors to have a go at playing their own kind of wild animal, if we wanted to do it without puppetry.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I mean, when I say puppetry, I don't mean like it being in that costume, but just having extensions on that person, e.g. the mouth and like the legs and stuff.
Yeah,
that's a kind of puppetry is what I mean. So it's not like your typical like marionette or anything like that.
Well, no, I was thinking because a warhorse is when you have the animal is controlled by external people, and you'll have 3 or 4 people on each animal, and so it gives a very different vibe. And I think what we'd want to think about is how we want to pull these elements together, whether if we're having the kind of very simple police car, or we're having very realistic flats, or having, and we'll pull these things together into, are we making it kind of skeletal things that we can imagine around, or are we making things as realistic as we can?
I think in some ways to have all of the earthly elements, like the flats and the police cars, to be these skeletal things, but then the aliens to be these full body costumes, would give an increased sort of sinisterness to the alien design. And talking about making them as black as possible as well, using a lot of backlighting for the aliens as well will emphasize their silhouette against the stage as well, and you can do that throughout to really give that impression. I mean, part of what I was thinking about doing as well is leaving it as long as possible to actually show the aliens. So in apart from the first one that Moses kills, so in the film we see the alien kill the policeman outside the van, but actually in this you could have the killing of the policeman happen off stage, and or even you could have it at the side of the stage just with like a quick flash of light, but if the main focus of the stage is on the police van, which we're creating out of this sort of skeletal bars, it means that like that reveal of these aliens, these creatures, happens later on in the show, and that kind of gives even more sort of lends even more sinisterness to those creatures.
Yeah, I really like that. I will come on in a sec to talk about how when we do eventually have to have a death on stage, how we'd go about that. But let's get to the underground car park.
Yeah.
So here we are in the underground car park. How do we differentiate this from the weed room if we're thinking halogen lights and things like that? I guess if we're having the tarpaulin in, then we've got that differentiation pretty much built in.
I think how far the lights are flown in. So for the weed room, you bring the halogen lights right down, and then for the underground car park, you just bring them halfway up. I think that the sort of distance between stage and light will kind of give that impression. I saw a production of Othello once that used candlelight, and the lower the candle, the sort of candelabras were, then the sort of actually the darker it was on stage because the light is further up. So and so that gave sort of impressions of day and night, and I think you could do a similar sort of thing here to give the different impression of setting.
Yeah, and I think there's definitely a chance to use colour here too. I mean, both for cost purposes and to give you that RGB effect. I probably wouldn't buy an actual fluorescent light bulb to fly in. I'd probably use a kind of the same sort of pipe that a fluorescent light bulb is in, with a frosted tube, and thread LED tape inside it, RGB LED tape, and operate it by that. So then, in my head, the fluorescent lights in the weed room are very blue, very purple. Of course, at the end, they're UV lights. We find out they're ultraviolet because that's how we reveal this stuff that Moses is covered in that's attracting these aliens. And I think when we eventually get to that moment, actual UV light would be able to create that moment very effectively, and you would be able to do exactly what the film is saying is happening. And so in the weed room, I would make that those florries a blue, a purple, but in an underground car park, they're very a harsh yellow, a harsh white, that kind of crisp nighttime vibe that you see. And I think that would differentiate. So we could use the same bar to save on your bars and the same lights, but again, flying them in lower, slightly different colour. And as well, you have to think, when you're flying a light in lower, just like you were saying about the candelabra, it creates different shadows. It's going to create much longer, much wider shadows like you get in a car park when they're much lower down, because the angle's a lot narrower.
Yeah,
and that would definitely give the same impression.
Yeah.
And as well, if we're thinking about projection, the tarpaulin's up, so you've got the grayscale background again to project against. It's not hard to project a bit of graffiti or markings on the wall like you get in car parks. I mean, the underground car park near me has a massive red block that says no exit on it at one point. So I'm not saying all underground car parks have things as obvious as that, but there's definitely things you can display there to really create that sense.
Yeah, I like that. And while we're talking about that, then when we come into these spaces and we're going to fly things in, we can fly them in quite rapidly, I'm sure, but the idea is that we're running into these spaces. And we were talking a little bit about that before, but do you think we could use sound maybe to communicate that sense of running from one place to another and moving sideways instead of up and down as flying often makes it look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can obviously use soundscapes, but another thing you could do is actually mic up the stage, and when they're in an underground car park, you take the sound of their footsteps and you just put a reverb on it live on stage, and you hear that reverb as they run across the stage, and that gives the impression of being in an underground car park. And then when you're in a corridor, you use a reverb again, but it's slightly muted, and that will give the impression of running down a corridor. So you can kind of create those things not only through like your typical soundscapes, but also create live soundscapes on stage by miking up around the stage and then using those live sounds and placing effects on those.
I think that'd be really cool.
That'd be a very good idea. And then tied together with speaker positions as well to give that effect of the sound physically moving around the stage and around the auditorium. That'd be a really nice way of setting the audience within the space and within the action.
I think that'd be really fun.
That's a really cool idea.
So we've got a lot of corridors, and at the end of the corridors we have lifts, and there's a lot of scenes that occur in lifts. But I mean, I was thinking mostly what happens is people run in or out of lifts and doors open and close onto different things, but we don't really have much action while the lift is moving. So if we're having this sort of two-tiered space, then I was thinking really we could just use one set of doors in the set people could go in and out of, and we could just imagine that it's moved up and down if we think that we're looking into a window onto one part of it.
That's different. I was thinking about that if you have a sort of in that back wall if you have a sort of concealed doorway, and when that opens for a lift, you can just have a sort of lit square behind there. You can literally just, because it's behind the set, you could literally put in like the lighting of a lift, and so when those doors open, there is a lift visible for the audience. Obviously that places it right at the back of the stage, but in some ways that would help because there's a couple of moments in the lift that would be quite hard to reproduce on stage. For example, when hi-hats men get killed in the lift, that being a little bit further back from the audience means the detail in the blood and the injury doesn't need to be as specific. So that would probably ease that as well.
And you could do something where, so in the film, it cuts from the lift doors closed and then they immediately open again and everyone's dead. And when you've got that space behind the set to do things like the doors shut and then you simply move something along so that you've got a pre-bloodied set there already or something along those lines, I think that'd be a really good way of making it look as if something's happening in real time.
Absolutely, yeah. In terms of the corridors and stuff, it's kind of a simple setting for us to create in a minimalist space. The one thing that is kind of harder is there's these sort of parkour and like BMX chases that take place quite early in the film. I think first of all, we'd probably have to cut any petrol-powered scooters that they have in the film and bring it just down to BMXs and like parkour-esque running, right? But part of that is you can use the sort of the blocks that we were talking about using to create a space that takes that much work to get over and around, and you can create that space. And then the chases might not be quite sort of as dynamic as the film, but you can create... There can be running back and forth.
At the beginning of the film, you've got Pest, who wants to make this jump from a bridge sort of thing onto a staircase underneath, and he can't do it. And then he's being chased by an alien, and later in the film he does do it. And it's just a really nice moment. I think with that setting you just described, I think we could still achieve that.
Definitely, yeah.
And I don't think it's beyond the question to be in search of actors who have these skills already. You know, casting directors nowadays are looking for vastly different things. Parkour is one of the things that they could definitely be asking. And we can really recreate that space on stage, so that can be very realistic.
Absolutely.
Okay, I think the last kind of place that we have to talk about, and we've used setting to go around a lot of different aspects here, but the last place we want to think about is a bin. So we have a character who is stuck in a bin most of the film. And realistically, this could be just something we cut completely. Or equally, we could just have, I think, just somewhere there where there is a bit.
See, what I'd really like to do with this is to take a real-life, big dustbin, industrial dustbin, cut the side off it, replace it with some black gauze, stick some birdies or maybe some LED tape inside the lid of it.
Nice.
And so you wheel this, what looks like a regular black bin, onto the stage at the start of the scene. The lights cut down on the rest of the theatre. They come inside this bin, revealing behind this gauze this kid and these two other people hid inside it. And it'd be tough to achieve. You need the right gauze, you need to light it with the right angle, but I think that would be an amazing reveal. And it'd really create that sense of claustrophobia. And you could still have, in some moments, these monsters, these aliens walking around the outside of the bin in complete darkness with only their teeth visible, to get that sense of complete fear and hiding away from these things and the dangers they're facing. And I think we could genuinely do that.
In some ways, the lighting inside the bin, you could just have it purely come from a sort of light that's meant to look like a phone screen, because in the film that's all he's lit by. So you could even have the actor have a sort of, you get the screens that just come up as pure white, and so it will just light his face, and you could do it that way. And what's great about that is you could have the LED sort of teeth going over it, which will give that impression of them being surrounded. But then also in that scene, he's calling round the block to let people know that it's not safe, and then you can have spotlights appear on other parts of the stage with people picking up the phone and learning that it's not safe in the block and that they need to get out as well.
Yeah, I agree. And if we go back to what we said earlier about if we do have this set of council housing terrace flats at the back of the stage where you can see the windows that are kind of frosted out, and you have the ability to light them up individually, then you could get this really nice moment of different lights clicking on and off with people silhouetted picking up the phone. And again, it doesn't increase your cast size because it's just a silhouette, it can be anyone, but you really get that sense of people responding to his calls and figuring out there's really something at risk here, there's a real danger.
I wonder if we can do this moment that I really like, where most of the film we only see one or two aliens at a time, and that would be because of their own budget, I assume, and helps us too. But there's one moment There's one moment where we're led to believe that there's only a couple of aliens, and then someone points behind the camera, and the camera whips around, and we see however many it is, 20 aliens climbing up the block. Do you think we can achieve that moment of realising the scale
I
in the theatre?
think it comes back to how we're representing the alien. I think either way, if we're representing the alien as a dark figure, a dark human, whether it's puppet or real, you can have them creep onto the stage relatively unnoticed, right? And all it would take to create that big reveal is to dim the lights very slightly where the actors are, raise it up very slightly where we've got these puppets hidden, and then turn on their teeth. And suddenly, from the darkness, from these characters who've just subtly crept onto stage where you haven't really noticed, these bright blue fangs start shining out at you. And then the audiences realise that it's there. Have you ever seen that clip of the basketballers passing around a basketball? And they say, count how many times they pass the basketball.
Of course.
And
I'm
then
a psychology student. It's a very
there you
famous
go.
psychology
And
experiment.
so then at the end, they say it was 32 times. And you're like, yeah, I got it right. And then they say, did you see the gorilla? And obviously you didn't. It's the exact same moment.
Yeah.
You can be focusing on the scene downstage, and all of these aliens can be creeping in completely unnoticed until your attention is drawn to them by the lights of the teeth coming on. And that can be really terrifying.
I think that would work really well. Yeah.
Thinking of other key lighting moments, then we have this moment towards the end where we realise that the reason why people are being eaten is because they're covered in this liquid that you can see with UV light. I just think that's a really cool moment we could quite easily, I think, achieve.
Yeah, that's really not that difficult. You just get a couple of UV cannons, probably put them on the fourth stage, just as a footlight, and then you can again get this really nice reveal. And so as they walk into the weed room, you can just turn on these UV lights slowly, and it won't make much of a difference to the actual lighting state, and then it suddenly just brings out this luminescent stuff.
And that's just something you need in costume as well, to have that luminescent.
Exactly, but also it wouldn't necessitate a different costume, because the costume can be covered in this stuff throughout. And it's just when you turn on the light it becomes visible.
Yeah.
And then you can have another really good reveal moment. I think that'll work really nicely.
I think that'd be really good.
The one moment maybe to talk about quickly is the reason you said about doing it in the space, pyrotechnics, is the scene where they are attacking several aliens in a corridor, and they're using fireworks to attack the aliens, and there's the whole place fills up with smoke. How would we best achieve that? Because the likelihood of just being able to hold fireworks in a theatre is pretty slim.
Yeah. And on top of that, what we also have is the camera can find one individual and can be with that one individual who can't see anyone else. Whereas on stage, perhaps with lighting we can, but it seems like it'd be very difficult to do.
Yeah, so it's often said that lighting in theatre is doing the job of a camera in film, because it's directing where the audience are looking, right? Coming back to what I was saying earlier about this smoke-filled stage in the corridor, it'd be quite easy to get shafts of light, probably coming from booms or assemblies coming kind of sideways, to quickly pierce out different people through the smoke. And then by doing that, you can kind of section off different areas and suggest who this person is able to see and who they aren't able to see. But the difficulty obviously is in scenes like the guy running down the corridor with the fireworks. My real struggle with this film is all the motion. How do you follow him in the motion, and when he gets to a certain place, then it's when this figure appears, because there's so much limited space on stage. How do you do that? And again, I don't know. Coming back to your fireworks though. I've been thinking how to do this. I don't have tons of experience in pyro, but one thing that I would do is get some kind of projectile that isn't a pyrotechnic, but then hide the pyrotechnic somewhere in the stage, so when the projectile goes, the pyrotechnic would flash as if it had exploded, but actually your projectile just crossed to the other side of the stage that you can just collect.
I think that would work effectively
ready for the next time,
especially if you're filling the stage with smoke in this moment. That will work effectively to see the projectile go, see sparks fly. There's kind of, and you will just, your brain would connect those two things.
And the lack of space means we can quite realistically say that everything that is fired actually comes from off stage.
Yes.
And so we don't have to have charges on stage that can be dangerous and around actors. We can have them all fire from off stage and just be seen.
Exactly. And don't forget, the pyro, obviously a lot of the effects in the film are really quite intense, but they don't have to be as intense on stage. The pyro itself doesn't have to be this massive explosion, because you can enhance it all with light. The light created from the explosion we can create with stage lights. All you want is that sense of spark, like I said, almost like a sparkler on bonfire night. You want that sense of sparks flying to suggest the pyro. So avoiding the budget escalating massively. yeah, it doesn't have to be the biggest pyro we've all ever seen.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And the other moment in this scene is where one of the characters gets killed in the smoke. So no one else knows quite that he's died yet until that last second just before he's actually killed. He sees someone and then he's killed. And I think that, like you were saying, using these shafts of light, you can quite effectively have someone find him. Just as the shaft of light finds him, we can then see the teeth of the creature behind him come on, and then you can just cut out the light and you know that person's been killed. And you can even use sort of red light and fake blood as well if you really want to sort of labour the point. But that kind of being selective with light there would mean that you'd be able to make that moment really effective, I think.
The only thing running around my mind at the minute is how to remotely dim these teeth of these aliens.
I think you just have them switch on and off.
From the man inside the costume.
You can just have control.
I think that would be part of the actor's job. I think it would have to be. Yeah.
There's too many to get them all to wireless DMX, isn't there? By a long way.
The problem would be is that yes, you can make all of this stuff black, but you couldn't make lights that come on like that black when they're off.
Yes.
And they would still reflect other lights.
Yes.
But I think it would be workable.
And having this big black cloak, if you have a place like almost a flap in it where the teeth can be pulled inside and then put back out again.
Or even simpler, could the actor simply have a way to close the mouth?
Yeah, that could work as well. So that way they can
Could even be always on in that case.
Yeah,
true.
And they can have full control over when the light is being seen, when it's not being seen, and you can place that responsibility in an actor's hands.
Okay, there's one other firework moment, which is when they chase the female alien into this hut, and then we don't see it happen, but somehow kill it with poppers and maybe a knife or whatever. That's a setting that actually we haven't really considered. Do you think that just happens off stage?
I don't think it has to happen off stage. I think where it has to happen is somewhere the audience can't see, but that doesn't necessarily mean in the wings. I think it wouldn't be that hard to create a setting on stage, either to go back to my go-to by flying in some kind of structure or even just a screen to silhouette behind. I think just to create a space, even like a flat with slats in it, just like a shed, and have light firing out from this shed, it would give the impression of something happening there.
Going back to that location we were talking about with the lift, you use exactly those same doors that you're going to use as the lift later on. And then that's a place where you can have all of the boys crowd round that space and therefore cover what's happening inside. But then you can have lights going off sort of above them that give the impression of some, the commotion happening inside that space.
That's a great
and that's kind of, using that space for sort of dual purpose, which would work quite well, I think.
Ultimately, for me, I was quite happy when I saw that scene in the play because I think it was a lot less problematic for us staging it than it could have been. Because the alien itself is probably a lot harder to recreate on stage than the aliens we see later that actually move.
Yeah.
But that female alien is very rarely mobile. So we see it when it's discovered, and then it scampers off without us noticing, and then it's hidden behind this shed. And for the rest of the play, it's carried along, and that's it's not an easy prop to make, but it's a prop that can be made.
Yeah.
And so to have the killing of it happen behind something, that's a lot easier for us to recreate than if it was done in front of the actor and you had to have the actions of the female alien done for.
And again, I think we're benefiting here from the fact that in relative terms this is a low budget film, and so we're working in a way, the filmmaker is working in a way in which we can replicate things because they're not very detailed.
That's true. I think on this topic though, the one thing we do need to discuss is the climactic moment of the big explosion in the flat at the end, because that is almost the crux of the end of the play. We have to recreate that somehow, and it's going to be the most technically challenging moment. It's going to require the most pyro if we're going down that route, but I don't see how you're going to create a huge fireball on stage.
Well, I think in the sense of, yes, a gas explosion is extremely hot and extremely wide-ranging. However, if we've got this structure where we have two flats on top of each other or four flats on top of each other, then I can see a way in which you can rig one up to explode in inverted commas in a controlled way, where the flats in a style of have either of you seen The Jungle?
I haven't, no.
So in that play, right at the end of the play, the police come to dismantle the jungle, and the places where the audience is sitting, they move away and smoke comes out of them, and it happens quite slowly because the idea is that you're being invaded. But I can't see why you couldn't just do the same thing but quicker and make just bits of things fall away and all very quickly, and maybe have even stagehands throwing a few things out, and then all you need is to create the impression of a large amount of fire. But if it's going upstage rather than downstage, then we don't have to believe that the heat is hitting us because it could be going the other way. That was my thought.
Yeah, I had a slightly different thought, pretty similar, is using that back structure is if we're doing where the sort of different windows light up, I think what we can do throughout is whenever they enter a flat, that window lights up on the back structure. So when they enter Ron's flat, that lights up. When they enter Moses' flat at the end, that one lights up. And then what you can do is you can have that lit at the back, and then you can have Moses, you can have all of the creatures in the stage space, and Moses sort of doing his thing to prepare it. And then you can have him even go out through that exit, the sort of back exit that we were talking about with the lift.
Right.
You could have him leave through there, the doors close, and then all the lights on stage go off, and then you could just do pyros out from that flat on that back structure. But if the back structure is just a plain concrete looking grey sort of slab that sort of has texture but is just plain, and then you're projecting those windows onto it, then that way you can just make an explosion happen projected, but you don't have to see anything be flown about.
Yeah.
And then you just use sparks with pyro from that location. That would kind of give that same effect.
Yeah, I think I'm going to be careful with relying on pyro because it just doesn't always work, but that would work well. And I think the whole moment after that where he's hanging down, has to pull himself up, I just don't think it really is necessary. I don't think it really adds much.
Yeah, and just thinking about this kind of physical act of movement, like you were talking about The Jungle, was it, Jake? The Jungle? The show that immediately came to my mind is one that's been touring for about 30 years now with the same set, and it's the Inspector Calls and Inspector Calls. And that has a huge house on stage that at one point towards the end of the play, the whole thing tips forwards towards to the audience, the whole thing swings open, a load of sugar glass comes out, smashes on stage, and about 5 individual pyros go off. Now, that's been happening on stages for about 30 years now, and we can create easily the same effect. I think this demands a bigger effect. It demands something more shocking. It's kind of the flame aspect of it that is making me question. But I think if that's possible for them 30 years ago, it's possible for us now. Someone who knows more about pyro and stage demolition than I do will be able to provide solutions, I'm sure.
And the good thing is the final scene after that is just a load of people outside the block. So you can kind of do whatever you want with that back section as long as you leave part of the front of the stage open to just have a crowd of people, and then Moses being arrested and taken off stage. And then him in the police van can even happen off stage. And you don't even need to see that moment necessarily.
It could do, yeah. And I think the big thing we haven't discussed so far is the hi-hat subplot. So we have this man who tries to make Moses into a cocaine dealer and is very suspicious of him and him taking control of the block away from him. And then the boys in the police car crash into his car. Then they have a fight, and an alien drops down and eats Hi-Hat's sidekick. And then later in the film, he tries to threaten to kill him with a gun. And then eventually he's killed by the aliens, and all this stuff happens. I think we can build it in. I think the big question is, how do you crash a car on stage?
I think it goes back to, I think the simplest way to do it would be using those skeletal car things, and then you just do it with flashes of light and loud crash sounds, and you're just going to have to trust the audience to know that a car crash has taken place. And I mean, straight away, because the actors on stage will start screaming about how this car crash is taking place. But I think if you have the clashing of the two headlights, a loud explosion or a loud crashing sound, and you have flashing sort of strobe lights, then that would give the impression of a car crash without having to literally build two cars and crash them into each other every single night, which I just don't think is going to be possible.
No.
So that would kind of be my suggestion. You may be losing some of the effect that it has in the film, but that is just the difference between doing a car crash on film and doing a car crash on stage. I think.
Yeah. What do you think, Will?
I agree. I've had one further thought without wanting to change everything we've discussed completely. But I was thinking about what you were saying earlier, Jake, and I think you were too, Ken, about putting it in a minimalist, smaller theatre. And I originally couldn't see how that could be possible until I've thought about theatre in the round. Because theatre in the round, by essence, has very little set. And almost all of the set or sense of location and time is created with lighting. And that solves a lot of your problems with a different location. And I think about any plays where I've tried to create an impression of fire, an impression of water, anything like that. It's always better to create to recreate the light coming off of these things than try and recreate something that looks like this. So instead of putting an image of fire flickering on a stage, you just get a red and a yellow light to flicker from off stage. And in the round, all these explosions could happen with light coming in as if the explosion itself is taking place elsewhere.
So to remove completely changing what we've talked about that way, how about a suggestion? Put it in thrust. So you can use some of those elements of round from behind the audience, but then you can still have that back of the main tower block. And so we're still keeping, because I think that that's a really important symbol of having the tower block throughout, and you can keep that. But in thrust, you can use those elements of fire coming from off stage, crashes coming from off stage, that come from behind the audience.
And you have more room to run in and out of things. I think making it not end on, having that extra intimacy with the audience allows more movement as well.
Yeah,
I agree.
Oh, because what I'd worry as well in the round is that you'd end up with actually in the play would just be people running in and out of the wings,
true.
saying, "Oh, that's happened over there, and that's happened over there," and nothing would really happen on stage.
Absolutely, yeah. I think it's important to have that back, but that actually does introduce those elements of having things in the round and having people run from exit to entrance, and yeah, I think that works really well.
A healthy compromise.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, I think that's everything to talk about.
We're pretty much out of time. I mean, we haven't really talked about costume, but
We talked about the costumes for the aliens.
Yeah.
And then in terms of the clothing, it's just... The clothing of the people is just similar to the film. There's no escaping it, that the way that they dress in the film works really well for those characters, and it worked in the film. And I don't think that there's no need to exaggerate them in any way for the stage. So I don't think that there would need to be any change made.
And there's some real scope for great makeup artistry here as well. All of the injuries. You talk about the scene in the lift with the 6 or 7 dead bodies packed inside. There's some incredible makeup that can be done there to really enhance that scene.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of cool props as well. We've got some weaponry that we can have.
Samurai sword.
There's samurai sword. There's a nunchuck, bikes, and all sorts of things on stage. So I think we're pretty much up time then.
Yeah, brilliant.
Thanks so much for coming on, Will.
No worries. Thanks for having me. I want to put this on now.
Let's make it happen.
Sounds really good. Let's do it.
Yeah.
When we have money.
A lot of money.
Speaking of money, you can donate to our Patreon. Yeah, maybe in the future. But yeah, thanks so much.
Yeah.
No worries. Thanks, guys.
Oh, is there anywhere that people can find you online?
There is. I'm always open to design work, so my website is www.willhaymentech.com, or send me an email at willhaymentech@gmail.com if you want to get in touch and check out the plays I've done. I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Cool, thanks very much, Will. Right, Jake, where can people find you online?
I am on Twitter at Jake Reesh. That's REESH. And where are you, Kev?
I'm on Twitter and Instagram at CalebLebster. CalebLebster.
Nice. And we are Maybe You Like It Productions. You can find us at Maybe You Like It with a text speak you on Instagram and Twitter.
Cool.
Yeah, because we're so cool, not because it was already taken. And at Maybe You Like It Productions on Facebook. And we're at www.maybeyoulikeit.co.uk, or drop us an email at info@maybeyoulikeit.co.uk.
Those last two are with a regular you, not a text speak you.
That's true.
Because we're professionals.
Okay. Thanks for listening, everyone. See you next week. And maybe you liked that, maybe you didn't.
Woo!